Welcome back to Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. Episode 13, Preparing Effectively for the Netherlands Dialogue from Reacting to Others to Nothing About Us Without Us. Segment 2, Opportunities and Dangers, Preparing for Success. Now let's examine the specific opportunities and dangers this dialogue presents, because living nothing about us without us requires clear analysis of both potential benefits and likely pitfalls. The primary opportunity is obvious: direct engagement between the African diaspora in Europe and CARICOM leadership around reparations priorities. But the primary danger is equally as obvious: legitimizing CARICOM's approach without ensuring it serves authentic community priorities developed through grassroots democratic processes. Here's what concerns me. CARICOM has been developing their reparations approach since 2013, building specific frameworks and institutional relationships that may or may not align with what the African heritage community based in Europe actually needs or wants. But here's a deeper issue. Nothing About Us Without Us challenges the entire premise that CARICOM should be developing approaches and then seeking endorsements from diaspora communities. Why should African diaspora communities in Europe adapt to CARICOM's framework rather than CARICOM adapting to frameworks that communities have developed through their own organizing? But it's deeper than that. The fact of the matter is that the CARICOM reparations framework, the 10-point plan to be more specific, does not incorporate the African diaspora who have links to the Caribbean. It does not represent our interests in the diaspora, and that's one of the biggest weaknesses. So we're not talking about consultation or recognition, we're talking about the fundamental flaw in CARICOM's approach that excludes African diaspora perspectives from the framework itself. Nothing About Us Without Us becomes essential because the current CARICOM plan literally operates without us, despite our historical and contemporary connections to the Caribbean. The Stop the Maangamizi campaign has been building analysis and concrete demands for decades. The Pan-African Reparations Rebellion Groundings methodology developed through this work has been tested through community practice. The Pan-African People's Assembly model has demonstrated how authentic democratic participation can work. These aren't just good ideas that deserve consideration, they're proven approaches that CARICOM should study and potentially adopt if they're serious about nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us means we don't enter conversations empty-handed, hoping others will include our perspectives in their plans. We enter with our own plans, our own analysis, our own demands, ready to engage as equals or not at all.
The representation dynamic illustrates both opportunity and danger clearly. On the one hand, the African diaspora in Europe have been organising for reparations for decades, building institutions, developing analysis, and creating networks that represent genuine community priorities. The Root Synergy Dialogue could amplify these grassroots voices and create platforms for sharing approaches across different European contexts. This would advance the kind of international coordination that effective liberation movements require. But the danger is that established diaspora organisations might end up legitimizing CARICOM initiatives rather than holding them accountable to community priorities, and that is African heritage community priorities, without clear accountability mechanisms. So partnership can become elite capture disguised as collaboration. The institutional context adds another layer of complexity. So I've already shared how the Netherlands government has apologised, but it was not an apology of substance. So this Roots Synergy Dialogue takes place within that contradictory context. So official acknowledgement of historical wrongs, combined with continued resistance to transformative remedies. How does this shape the possibilities for genuine progress versus symbolic recognition? The opportunity is using institutional contradictions to build pressure for the realization of comprehensive, holistic reparations. The danger is accepting symbolic gestures as adequate responses to centuries of exploitation.
The educational component presents similar opportunities and dangers. Learning about global reparations framework and international treaties and UN frameworks could provide tools for organizing, but it could also reinforce the idea that legitimate reparations organizing must conform to existing legal and political structures rather than challenging the systems that created and maintain exploitation. Effective education would examine both the possibilities and limitations of existing frameworks while developing analysis that enables communities to advance transformative agendas rather than accepting incremental reforms.
Here's where effective preparation becomes crucial. Communities considering participating should ask themselves, what do we want to achieve through this dialogue that advances our own independent organising capacity? If the answer is learning about CARICOM's approach and building networking relationships, that's legitimate but limited. If the answer is advancing specific community priorities and building sustained coordination for comprehensive reparations campaigns, that requires a different type of preparation. Effective preparation would include developing collective analysis of current conditions, identifying concrete demands that build towards larger goals, and creating accountability mechanisms that ensure any partnerships serve community priorities rather than institutional interests. So, for instance, in Bristol, when the Atonement and Reparations motion was passed in March 2021, part of what the motion text speaks to is the importance of African heritage communities developing their own reparations plans. And that is what we have gone on to call the Pempamzie Mpangos. That's the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, that is. Pempamzie Mpangos. So these alternative progression self-repair plans. That's really what we should be coming to a table with in terms of an effective dialogue and a dialogue among equals.
The question of autonomous organising capacity becomes central here. The dialogue includes workshops on building Pan-African diaspora organisations in Europe and community self-determination structures. This suggests that effective reparations organising requires communities to build their own institutional capacity rather than depending on external representation. But here's what nothing about us without us demands. These aren't just nice workshops to attend. They're requirements for meaningful participation in any dialogue about our futures. You cannot have nothing about us without the us being organised. You cannot assert community control if communities haven't built the capacity for collective analysis, democratic decision-making, and coordinated action. The workshops are only valuable if they contribute to building this capacity, not just sharing information about how to build it. The opportunity is using this dialogue to strengthen existing organising capacity that continues long after the event ends. The danger is treating workshop participation as sufficient preparation rather than the beginning of more intensive organising work.
The international dimension creates both tremendous opportunities and serious dangers. Coordinated global African reparations organising could create mutually reinforcing pressure that individual national movements can't achieve alone. But here's what nothing about us without us means for international coordination. It cannot mean subordinating local organising to external priorities or even organising within a specific country context, even when those priorities come from other African heritage communities or institutions like CARICOM or even the African Union. International solidarity must strengthen local capacity, or global capacity as we would prefer to say, to control local struggles rather than draining energy towards supporting distant initiatives that will never benefit us because they were not designed for us. The question becomes, how do we build international connections that amplify each community's ability to implement their own agenda rather than creating pressure to conform to external frameworks? Nothing about us without us means every community maintains the right to say no to international initiatives that don't serve their specific needs, even if those initiatives appear progressive or come from other African people. Listeners, here's a concrete organising exercise. This week, identify one reparations issue affecting you, your local community, or your people, whichever group you identify with. It could be education related, housing related, healthcare, or even economic development. Then take these 3 steps. Firstly, talk to 5 other people in your community or group or neighbourhood about this issue and ask what they think should be done about it. Secondly, find out if any existing organisations are already working on this issue and what their approaches are. Thirdly, decide whether you want to join existing efforts or start something new based on what your own conversations have revealed. This is how Nothing About Us Without Us starts, with organised community discussions that lead to organised community action.
The security considerations deserve attention as well. As we discussed in episode 12, effective organising that threatens material interests inevitably faces state repression and elite manipulation. But Nothing About Us Without Us adds another dimension to security concerns. When communities assert genuine control over reparations processes, they threaten not just the state interests, but also the interests of institutions and organisations that benefit from being intermediaries between communities and power structures. Creating databases of reparations organisers, developing international networks, and building coordination between movements operating in different territories all create opportunities for surveillance and disruption. But they also create opportunities for co-optation by actors who want to manage rather than support genuine community control. Effective participation addresses both kinds of security threats, protecting organising information and participants from hostile state actors while building independent capacity that cannot be controlled or manipulated by friendly institutions that may not share our commitment to genuine Nothing About Us Without Us.
But I want to emphasise that acknowledging dangers doesn't mean avoiding engagement. It means engaging on our own terms, rather than accepting whatever terms that others offer. The root synergy dialogue taking place in the Netherlands could advance authentic community-led participatory reparations processes, which means the mechanisms and approaches for effecting and securing holistic reparations, if participants enter with clear preparation, collective analysis, concrete demands or programs or strategies, some thinking through about what accountability mechanisms are and look like, and also being able to build a sustained organising capacity that treats the dialogue as one component of a larger power building work. Without effective preparation, the same event could reinforce elite control by creating the appearance of community involvement while maintaining institutional control over outcomes.
This connects to our broader analysis of the current moment. Global conditions are creating openings for transformational reparations demands, but they're also intensifying elite efforts to control reparations discourse before grassroots movements develop sufficient capacity to assert genuine nothing about us without us. The question facing every liberation movement is whether we can build organized capacity fast enough to seize these opportunities before they're captured by elite actors who benefit from symbolic recognition without comprehensive transformation. What worries me is that many reparations discussions focus on convincing institutions to do the right thing rather than building the power to compel them to respond to our demands, whether they want to or not. Nothing about us without us isn't about better advocacy or more persuasive arguments. It's about building the organized power to control outcomes rather than just influence inputs.
What would effective preparation for the Root Synergy Dialogue taking place in the Netherlands look like in practice? First, participating representatives from communities would develop collective analysis of CARICOM's approach, identifying where it aligns with grassroots priorities and where it diverges. This requires organised study and democratic discussion rather than just individual opinion. Second, they would establish concrete demands or platforms, programs, agendas that build towards larger transformation rather than accepting whatever outcomes that existing institutions, be they governmental or non-governmental, propose. These demands would be specific, achievable, and cumulative, creating stepping stones towards holistic or comprehensive reparations.
Third, they would create accountability mechanisms that ensure any partnerships serve community priorities. This might include regular community assemblies that evaluate progress, collective decision making about ongoing participation, and clear criteria for withdrawing support if initiatives don't serve grassroots interests. Fourth, they would treat participation as capacity building opportunities that strengthen ongoing organizing rather than as an end in itself. Every aspect of engagement will be designed to increase communities' capacity for future struggles.
Most importantly, effective preparation would connect international engagement to local power building or local power building. The goal wouldn't be influencing CARICOM or building partnerships with institutions, but using international coordination to strengthen grassroots organising capacity in specific territories. So we talk about the CARICOM 10-point plan, but how many of us are actually engaging with representatives of civil society in the Caribbean region and their own organisations? This requires what Walter Rodney referred to as groundings, connecting international analysis to local organising that builds concrete power to transform daily conditions affecting us as the African diaspora in Europe. When we say Yɛresiesie yen ho, we are preparing ourselves. We're talking about the kind of preparation that enables us as communities to engage with institutions from positions of strength rather than seeking inclusion as supplicants. Segment 3. Practical principles for institutional engagement. Now, let's develop practical principles that reparations movements, groups, organisations can apply to any institutional engagement, whether with CARICOM states, the African Union, even European governments or other bodies that claim to advance reparations but operate according to their own interests and constraints. The first principle is independent preparation. Before engaging with any institution, communities should develop their own independent analysis and priorities through collective processes that build our organising capacity rather than just sharing our own individual opinions. This means studying the institution's actual track record, not just their stated positions and advocacy standpoints in the media. It means understanding or overstanding their material interests and their political constraints. And it means developing clear criteria for what constitutes success from community perspectives rather than just accepting institutional definitions.
The second principle is concrete demands rather than moral appeals. Institutions can ignore moral arguments about why reparations are deserved, but they must respond to demands that create material consequences for inaction. But nothing about us without us adds another dimension. Our demands must emerge from our own analysis of what we need, not what institutions say they can provide or what communities have demanded in their contexts. Concrete demands that reflect someone else's priorities aren't meaningful, even if they're specific and achievable. The All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice demand, developed by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, illustrates this principle. It emerged from analysis of UK conditions and what's needed to advance reparations in that specific context. It wasn't developed or adapted from demands elsewhere or designed to fit within existing parliamentary processes.
Yes, that's true, but I just wanted to add that the APSITAJ, as we call it by acronym, the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice, is designed to not just hear testimony from us in the UK, because the UK had an empire, and some argue there is, Empire 2.0. It is designed to hear voices from around the world where African people were enslaved and also colonized. So it's very, very unique. And that's what makes it, I think, so also revolutionary as well, because it transcends borders. It's not just about hearing testimonies of quote unquote black people in Britain. Yeah, because many of us here came from somewhere else, and we have to recognize those journeys that our people have taken. Anyhow, the third principle is building lasting capacity rather than seeking temporary influence. Every institutional engagement should increase communities' own organising capacity for the struggles that they are engaged in, regardless of immediate outcomes. This means treating meetings, conferences and dialogues as organising opportunities that develop collective analysis, clear thinking and coordinated action, rather than just information sharing or networking events. It means creating structures that continue building power long after specific engagements end, rather than depending on periodic access to institutional spaces.
The fourth principle is maintaining flexibility while building cumulative pressure. Communities must be prepared to escalate, de-escalate, and withdraw from institutional engagements based on whether they're advancing community priorities or reinforcing elite control. Nothing about us without us means always being ready to walk away from any process that does not serve our interests, regardless of how prestigious or promising it appears. This requires having alternatives ready, other venues, other tactics, other relationships that can advance our agenda when institutional engagement becomes counterproductive. This is why flexibility prevents communities from becoming invested in particular tactics or relationships that may not serve larger liberation goals. Nothing about us without us is meaningless if we can't say no when processes fail to respect our agency and priorities.
The fifth principle is international coordination that strengthens our local organising rather than draining energy towards external agendas that don't benefit us in any way. Global solidarity must build mutual support between autonomous movements rather than subordinating our local struggles to international initiatives. This means sharing analysis and tactical knowledge across the different regions and territories where we are, while maintaining local, or we would say global, control over priorities and decision making. It means building relationships based on shared principles rather than organisational hierarchies, and most importantly, it means ensuring that international coordination amongst various African heritage communities and our organising structures and processes increases each community's capacity to win the struggles that they are waging wherever they are, rather than redirecting our organising energy towards supporting distant campaigns that are not about us anyway.
The sixth principle is security culture that protects organizing information and participants while building decentralized capacity that can continue operating under hostile conditions. As movements become more effective at asserting nothing about us without us, they face increased surveillance and disruption from state and elite actors who benefit from existing systems. Engagement with institutions can provide intelligence about community organizing while creating opportunities for manipulation. Security culture doesn't mean avoiding engagement, but it means protecting information while building regenerative capacity that can reconstitute under pressure.
That's great, Brother Simeon. These principles apply beyond formal institutional engagement to any situation where reparations movements, groups or organisations interact with bodies that claim to advance community interests but operate according to different priorities, and in some cases rather suspect priorities. Whether we're talking about academic conferences, with universities or policy forums, interfaith coalitions or political campaigns, the same questions apply. Does this engagement advance independent African heritage community priorities or any of the various communities that might come within that, developed through democratic processes? Does it build lasting organising capacity? Does it create cumulative pressure for transformation rather than just symbolic recognition?
What makes this institutional engagement particularly challenging for reparations movements is the way it can co-opt legitimate grievances while channeling resistance towards acceptable outcomes that don't threaten fundamental power structures. Institutions can acknowledge historical injustices, express sympathy for contemporary suffering, and even provide limited remedies while maintaining the system that created and continues to reproduce exploitation. Effective engagement requires distinguishing between symbolic recognition and comprehensive transformation, between individual opportunities and collective liberation, between inclusion in existing systems and transformation of oppressive structures.
This connects directly to our analysis of elite capture. Institutions often seek to co-opt liberation movements, including reparations movements, by offering symbolic recognition, individual advancement opportunities, or limited reforms that address symptoms rather than the causes of the Maangamizi, in our case. Effective institutional engagement requires building the analytical capacity to distinguish between authentic progress and sophisticated co-optation attempts.
But I want to emphasize that nothing about us without us doesn't avoid institutional engagement. It means engaging on our own terms rather than accepting whatever terms others offer, from positions of strength rather than dependency. Institutions have resources, access, and legitimacy that community movements can utilize for liberation purposes, but only if the communities enter with nothing about us without us as a non-negotiable principle rather than an aspirational goal. When communities have built sufficient organized capacity, they can engage with institutions to advance their own agendas rather than hoping institutions will recognize their humanity and respond with appropriate remedies. But if we haven't built that capacity, nothing about us without us becomes an empty slogan rather than a practical demand.
The key is treating institutional engagement as one tactic within larger African liberation work, rather than as the primary path to freedom. When communities have built sufficient organised capacity, they can engage with institutions to advance their own agendas, rather than hoping that these institutions will recognise their humanity and respond appropriately. This requires what we call practical realism, understanding both the possibilities and limitations of existing systems while building the power to transform or replace them according to our own community priorities.
Now, listeners, here's a practical exercise. Think about the last institutional meeting or event you attended related to reparations or African liberation. Write down who set the agenda for that meeting. What specific outcomes did your family, group, or community want from that meeting, and did you achieve them? And lastly, if that meeting didn't serve your community's interests, did you have the capacity to leave or change the direction? If you can't answer these questions clearly, you're participating in processes where nothing about us without us doesn't apply. If not, you may be trapped in just reacting to what others propose rather than advancing your own agenda. Patterns that limit movement's transformative potential regardless of how committed individual participants may be.
What gives me hope about current conditions is that younger organisers especially are developing clear thinking that connects historical analysis to contemporary resistance, international solidarity to local organising, and institutional engagement to autonomous power building. The question is whether we can develop and share organising methods fast enough to compete with elite manipulation before opportunities are captured by actors who benefit from symbolic progress rather than comprehensive transformation. This is why effective preparation for events like the Roots Synergy Dialogue taking place in the Netherlands matters, not just for immediate outcomes, but for building the kind of analytical capacity that enables movements to seize the opportunities as they emerge. Segment 4. Practical action for contemporary conditions. Now let's get concrete about how listeners can apply these principles to their own organising context, because analysis only matters if it translates into increased community capacity to compel the reparations that we deserve rather than just demand or request them. The first challenge is developing collective analysis through organised study and action learning rather than just sprouting our own individual opinions. This means creating structured processes where communities, and I mention communities, of people, literally, not just me, myself, and I, where we can examine current conditions, study successful liberation struggles that we have waged, and in fact other people have waged, and develop shared understanding of the opportunities and constraints. Effective action begins with clear analysis, understanding that transformation requires challenging existing power structures rather than seeking inclusion in systems, processes, and anything else designed to maintain our exploitation and subordination.
The second challenge is building concrete organising capacity rather than just expressing moral positions or attending educational events. This means creating ongoing structures that develop collective thinking, coordinated action, and sustained pressure for specific demands that build towards larger transformation. Nothing about us without us requires the us to be organised. You cannot assert community control without communities that can collectively decide democratically and act coordinately. Every community can begin building this capacity regardless of their current organizational level, but they must commit to the ongoing work rather than the episodic participation. You can establish Maangamizi Educational that develop collective analysis, create mutual aid networks, and meet immediate needs while building solidarity, or organize campaigns around local reparations demands. But nothing about us without us means that they can't be individual initiatives. They must build collective capacity for communities to control their own liberation processes.
The third challenge is maintaining independence while building international coordination. Communities must develop the capacity to engage with larger movements and institutions from positions of strength rather than dependency. This requires what Omowale Malcolm X called by any means necessary thinking, being willing to build alliances, engage institutions, or work independently based on what advances our liberation goals rather than what appears respectable or acceptable to existing power structures or elites. Listeners, here's another concrete exercise. In your own organizing context, write down 3 specific things that your family, your group, or community has decided it wants from reparations or it wants to achieve. Not what you personally think, but what your family, group, or community has or is discussing and agreeing or has agreed on collectively. If you can't write down 3 things, that tells you that your first step is about organizing discussions within your family, and we've suggested Maangamizi as a good starting point, or your group, or even your community, to develop those shared priorities. If you can write them down, ask yourself, when you engage with institutions, are you advancing these family or group or community decided priorities, or are you adapting to agendas that others have set or just pushing your own?
The fourth challenge is security culture that protects organizing while building decentralized capacity that can operate under hostile conditions. As reparations organizing becomes more effective at asserting nothing about us without us, it will face increased surveillance and disruption. But here's what many movements miss. Security threats don't just come from hostile state actors. They also come from well-meaning institutions and allies who want to help by providing resources, connections, and legitimacy that can gradually shift community priorities away from genuine nothing about us towards more manageable forms of consultation and inclusion. Communities can begin developing security culture through practices that protect both their organizing information and their organizational independence, such as building relationships based on demonstrated commitment rather than shared rhetoric, creating communication methods that don't depend on mainstream platforms, and maintaining financial independence that prevents dependency on external funding sources that might influence community priorities.
The current global context creates both tremendous opportunities and dangers for our own reparations organising, as we've already established. So global economic instability, the declining legitimacy of Western imperial powers, and rising resistance movements worldwide create openings that we can push through some of our transformative demands. But these same conditions intensify elite efforts to control our discourses, our liberation discourse, our reparations discourse, before grassroots movements develop sufficient capacity to assert genuine nothing about us without us.
What makes this moment particularly significant is the combination of increased awareness of reparations issues with limited organized capacity in many grassroots movements. People understand that reparations are necessary, but many communities haven't developed organized power to compel them. This creates opportunities for elite actors like Dennis O'Brien to capture reparations discourse by offering initiatives that appear progressive while serving their own interests rather than community priorities.
But it also creates opportunities for organised movements to advance their own agendas and demands precisely because existing systems are visibly failing and people are open to alternatives, comprehensive alternatives, revolutionary alternatives, rather than just reforms. The question for every listener is, are you building the kind of organised capacity that can seize these opportunities, or are you trapped in just reacting to what others propose? Patterns that limit your movement's own transformative potential and capacity to affect and secure the reparatory justice goals or changes that you seek. Effective action for reparations means building organised community power that can compel the changes that we wish to see, whether those existing institutions cooperate or resist.
Your challenge for this week is concrete. Choose one aspect of Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves, that you can begin building immediately in your local context. Maybe it's establishing Maangamizi that develop collective analysis of current conditions. Maybe it's connecting with reparations organizations in other territories to share knowledge. Maybe it's developing concrete demands around local reparations issues that build comprehensive transformation. Don't wait for perfect conditions or complete analysis. Begin building capacity through practice and develop analysis through organizing experience, rather than waiting to organize until your analysis is complete.
So what is, I think, perhaps interesting about this moment is that communities worldwide are beginning to understand that African liberation requires clear thinking, organized building, and sustained resistance, rather than hoping for elite benevolence or institutional reform. The ancestors and ancestresses that we honoured in our libation overstood this. They built power through careful analysis, action learning, organised resistance, and sustained struggle, rather than simply appealing to the conscience of their oppressors. Now it's our responsibility to build on their legacy with organising methods appropriate to our contemporary conditions and experiences of the Maangamizi. Every person who develops this clear thinking, the organising skills, and builds, concrete commitment to African liberation increases our collective capacity to effect and secure the reparatory justice change that we wish to see.
This is why collective preparation for reparations, Yɛresiesie, must include active preparation, not just historical education or moral development. We must prepare ourselves to engage with institutions, movements, and opportunities from positions of strength, rather than seeking inclusion as supplicants. Effective action means building the power to set the terms of engagement rather than accepting whatever terms others offer. That's the challenge and opportunity of our historical moment. As we conclude this analysis of the Netherlands dialogue and institutional engagement generally, the path forward becomes clear. The current moment offers both unprecedented opportunities and sophisticated dangers for reparations organising. Events like the Netherlands Dialogue can advance authentic community-led participatory reparations processes, the mechanisms and approaches for achieving reparations, if participants enter with thoughtful preparation, collective analysis, concrete demands, accountability mechanisms, and structured organising capacity that treats every engagement as power-building opportunities.
But without effective preparation, the same events can reinforce the elite control by creating the appearance of community involvement while maintaining institutional control over the outcomes. The difference lies in whether communities develop our own independent organising capacity or remain trapped in just responding to what others propose. Our analysis of practical principles for institutional engagement applies beyond this specific root synergy dialogue to every situation where reparations movements interact with bodies that claim to advance community interests but operate according to different priorities. And I talk about reparations movements because we need to begin to see that we have a movement. I think that's part of the weaknesses from the community side. We speak as individuals, we speak as members of specific organizations and think that is the whole. No, it's not. It's a movement, and a movement has many different players in it. There's always lots of contestation, even different agendas and programs, even though we may be all pro-reparations. But it's movements that build power, and it's movements that achieve the kind of structural and systemic change that is required in terms of being able to compel the stopping of the Maangamizi in our lifetime.
And that leaves the choice to every listener as to whether to remain trapped in just responding to elite initiatives and hoping for institutional benevolence, or to begin building organised capacity that enables communities to advance independent agendas regardless of whether others cooperate. This isn't about choosing between engagement and independence. It's about developing the organised power to engage from positions of strength rather than dependency.
So, Brother Simeon has also already set some challenges for you in terms of identifying one aspect of Yɛresiesie, that is preparing ourselves, how you are preparing yourself, that you can begin immediately. He's spoken about the importance of establishing ma'atso as a jurors that we have spoken about in several shows for building that collective analysis and developing the concrete demands and agendas that come from your family, your group or community. Of course, we've spoken about building international coordination and the necessity in these times for strengthening security culture. So we're really asking you to take one step that builds that cumulative power rather than just simply expressing reparations support or just championing that famous slogan, reparations now. Yɛresiesie begins with understanding that preparation itself is power building. Every person who develops their clear thinking, strategic analysis, builds their organising capacity, develops their organising skills and commitment to community control, increases our collective capacity as African heritage communities to compel the enforcement of reparations rather than just simply demanding them. We prepare ourselves not to wait for permission, but to build the conditions for what we want to see actually materialize.
And in wrapping up, this is
Esther Xosei
and Brother Simeon on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that active preparation for reparations, Yɛresiesie, means building the organised capacity to engage with any institution, movement or opportunity from positions of strength rather than just hoping for the best. Thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for your continued support.
Join us next time as we continue exploring how Yɛresiesie, we are preparing ourselves applies to the challenges and opportunities facing African reparations movements in these ever-changing times.